Right, everybody, welcome to this evening's entertainment. We are so grateful to have you along. We're letting everybody in who's joining us. If we can just ask you all to please switch off your videos and your audio in particular. In fact, you know what, you can leave your video on if you want to. If you want to be seen and see, you're welcome. But if you could please keep your audio off all the way through. This is the equivalent of a theater experience. We're not looking for interaction from the audience tonight. But it's fantastic to have you all along. We're just letting everybody in as they come in. Thank you for joining us bang on time this wonderful Saturday evening, wherever you find yourself in the world. Okay. So, Rob Caskie, everybody knows who you are, Rob. That's why they've joined this evening. So it is really one of those no introductions needed things tonight. My name is Graeme Codrington. On the other side of the screen is Rob Caskie, one of South Africa's master, one of the world's master storytellers. Rob, how are you doing today in the fine province of KZN?
Oh, Graeme, thank you for that glowing introduction. I couldn't be doing better. I'm feeling on top of the world. I always get a bit nervous before these presentations. The enthusiasm and the engagement of your guests and mine is infectious, and I really hope we're going to have a good session, and thank you for leading it.
So, Rob, just a quick question at aside. You know, both you and I are used to standing up in front of audiences, and I think a lot of people ask me, do you get nervous? And the answer from my side is that if I didn't get nervous, I'd be worried. Because for me, the nerves, it's not debilitating nerves. I don't get nervous to the sense when I can't speak or my knees are knocking, but I get nervous because for me, the nerves show me that it means something. There's a whole lot of people who've given up their time. They've come to share a moment with me, and I don't want to disappoint them. So I get nervous. I've been nervous for a little while, setting up here, making sure I've got all my notes and everything's ready. You get nervous as well, don't you, Rob?
Oh, Graeme, I get very nervous. You know, I always say to folks that there are certain things that I like to go through before I present live. And most importantly, those little protocols are important for me trying to get the butterflies to fly in formation. And I feel, as you do, that folks are giving up their time. Oftentimes people are giving up their money to come along and be entertained. And you are expected to present and entertain in a meaningful manner. And most importantly, I want people to leave with something tangible and positive. So I get very nervous before these presentations, and I'm delighted and relieved, in fact, to hear that you do too.
No, absolutely. And so is it easier for you to present to a little video camera and a little green dot on your computer with nobody else in the room? Or is it easier to present to a room full of people?
Graeme, I've been considering this a great deal. I find it infinitely easier to present to a room full of people. I'm finding this online adjustment and presenting to a camera that is rather inanimate very difficult indeed. And what I find perhaps even more difficult is the lack of feedback and response from the audience. You don't know if the audience are laughing, and if they are, and you hope they are, you don't know for how long. So you tend to just keep going at your tempo, and the audience might miss something because they might still be laughing or considering a point you've made. So I found the transition to online presenting very difficult indeed. It is getting easier along with my Patreon presentations and recordings, but there's no doubting that given the option, I would far rather present to a room full of live human beings than to this inanimate camera.
Yeah, and this now just shows the difference in personalities and styles, because I must say I'm very happy to continue sitting in my little studio on my own for the rest of my life. I've always enjoyed the conferences where where there've been massive spotlights in my eyes and I can't even see the audience. Not that I disrespect them, I love having an audience, but for me, I don't get that energy. But for you as a storyteller, I get it. But you know what, Rob, I do need to say, and this is in all seriousness, but I am saying it in front of 80 people. You've just got better and better and better over the last few months. Just for everybody watching in, Rob started on a website called Patreon. Patreon's an interesting name, isn't it? It goes back to sort of the Middle Ages, where artists and entertainers would have patrons who would pay them to come up with entertaining stories and regale the courts. And somebody set up this wonderful website. You can see it on the screen there. I'll put it in the chat box if you are joining us live. And they set up a website called Patreon, where if you know of an entertainer or somebody who makes their living by sharing information with others or sharing art with other people, then they can set up a page where you can go and support them, either with once-off gifts, or you can support them on a regular basis. And the idea is that they then create content that they share with their patrons. And so Rob has been doing this, and this is one of the reasons why I've been doing some of these evenings through lockdown, is I am hugely passionate about supporting my friends who are in the arts, who are in entertainment, who make their money by being in front of audiences. Of course, all of that's gone at the moment. And so where guys like Rob have moved online and taken their stuff online, I'm passionate about supporting them and hope that you will join me. So there's no cost for this evening, but the only cost is that I ask you to please consider going to patreon.com/Rob Caskie and supporting Rob, either just once off, take it as an entry fee for tonight's entertainment, or set up a monthly contribution to Rob. And what Rob does, well, Rob, you tell us, what do Patreons get in exchange for giving you a little bit of their hard-earned cash?
Graeme, thank you for that. On Patreon, I have 3 different tiers or levels of membership. The entry-level tier, which we call Acacia, gets my patrons to get 4 stories from me. We basically work it on 1 a week per month. I base them on the TED principle. I aim at about 17 or 18 minutes. Some are a bit longer, some are a bit shorter. The next level, which we call Mahogany, gets the folks those 4 stories online, and then I give a live Zoom session and Zoom talk once a month to that level of membership. And once they've been on that level of membership for 3 months, we're going to be sending them a PDF copy of my book. And then the top level of membership, which we call Red Ivory, gets everything included in the lower levels, plus a 45-minute session one-on-one with me once a month. So other folks want to hear a story from me, or they want a question-answer session, which we do once a month. And I try and keep in regular contact with my patrons. Patreon is a very, very good advertiser of the teasers and the stories as they come up. Now in July, we're getting into the swing of things. And July, the way the days are spaced, we basically have 5 weeks. So I've recorded 5 stories for July. There will be the Zoom session as well, and then my special session with those on the top tier. So that in a nutshell really is what the memberships on Patreon involve and what I'm offering in terms of each of those different levels or tiers of membership.
And just so everybody knows, they're absolutely brilliant. For all of you who've seen Rob, wherever you've seen him, I know some people are joining us because you've seen Rob at company events you've been to. Some of you have seen him in private spaces. He does work on boats. You might have seen him there. If you know his work, you'll know it's always worthwhile. And as I said, Rob, you're just getting better and better online. So, you know, I know you feel you do better face to face, but you're doing well in this virtual world as well.
Thank you, Graeme.
Okay, so I think we have everybody in the house. We've got 81 people. Rob, I don't know if you can see your screen, but 81. In fact, it's more than 81 people, because a few people have told us now there's a whole family sitting watching you on screens around the place. So I'm sure we've got well over 100, maybe even a few hundred people doing it. So lovely to have you all with us. If you haven't been to one of my wine tasting sessions again, this is the cheeky part of the evening, because of course we can't all share this wine, right? So the bottom line is I love wine. I'm a complete amateur, but I'm an amateur who takes it seriously. And I love sharing my wine with friends, and I have enough wine to last me for a few lifetimes of lockdown here at home. So apologies to you if you don't have wine this evening. You can just watch me drink wine. I know a few people. No, I see Francois, I see Lisa. They've got their wine. In fact, some of you even went out and bought Culiacan wine. So I'm super impressed with the effort that you made. Well, let's thank them, Culiacan, for sponsoring this evening. Again, we love brands, we love organizations that support the arts as well. I've sent out a number of emails to different organizations asking them if they'd support, and many of them have come back with their signs of support. So this evening is brought to you by Culiacan. If you're a wine drinker and you haven't tried their wine before, give it a go. They have a new CEO. But the old winemaker is still there, and their wines are going strong. I hadn't really got into Culiacan before they approached Rob and I and said they'd be interested to get involved. So this has been a new vineyard for me to discover, and I've loved it. Loved it so far. For those of you who don't know, that's not the picture I wanted to show you. There's the one there. So Culiacan, let me just get into my studio mode here. I'm playing with new software tonight. So Culiacan is one of the oldest wine estates in the Cape, the Fair Western Cape. Started by Adriaan van der Stel, the son of Simon van der Stel, the first Governor General of the Cape when the Dutch had come. Simon van der Stel famously started the Constantia area wines and Kirstenbosch Gardens and so on. And his son, who eventually took over the governorship from his father, took an ox wagon. And this is, Rob, I've worked hard. I hope you'll be impressed with me this evening. I've worked hard to link into your theme this evening because old Adriaan got in an ox wagon and headed along the coast of the False Bay. And he headed out for 3 days. And I wonder if we drove out of Cape Town today and drove for 3 days, I wonder where we'd end up. But he ended up in what today is Strand or Somerset West, and then headed 6 kilometers inland into a little valley that goes up into the hills. So and then he established this farm called Culiacan. For the South Africans, you'll know what that means. It basically means it's far away. Okay, so not huge on the naming and branding genius. It's just like, okay, we've gone 3 days, this is far away, let's just settle here. And he established it was a small little farm, a small farm, 30,000 hectares. It's wonderful to be a colonial stealer of land, right? Let's make sure we modern and use the right language about what he did there. But anyway, just a modest 30,000 hectares, and he planted vineyards and he made huge farms. He planted some camphor trees in 1700, right? So this happened in 1700, spot on. And he planted some camphor trees, and those camphor trees are still there, 320 years old, still on the property. 6 years later, he was hit with a corruption charge. South Africa, government, corruption, surely not possible. And he was sent back to the Netherlands, and the farm was then bought by, now I do need my notes. The farm was actually broken into 4 different farms. So those of you who know your Cape farms will know Morgenster, Lourensford, and Cloutenberg. And those are the 4 farms that now make 4 farms out of the original one. And the Culiacan farm was then bought by the Tennyson family, who basically owned it for a century. And then it was taken over by the Phillips family, and they owned it for most of the 1800s. But the vineyards were all devastated by a disease. In fact, this happened quite regularly in the 1800s in the Western Cape. Lots of disease and pestilence. And again, Rob, I think there might be a little bit of overlap to some of your story today, this evening. So the vineyards were wiped out, and in fact, the farm was left in a bit of a ruinous state until 1917 is when the Phillips bought the farm, and they then established gardens and vegetable places. It was then bought by another family in the middle of the 1900s, and they put cattle on the farm. And then finally in 1987, this was the thing that fascinated me, is the farm was bought by Anglo-American. Most wine farms are owned by families and by individuals, but this was bought by a company, a mining company of all companies, obviously trying to diversify some of what they did, bought the farm and spent 4 years doing soil samples, looking at the rock, deciding on where to plant which grapes, really doing it very, very scientifically. And also restoring all of the farm buildings. So you can see the magnificent photograph there. In fact, Culiacan is now rated in the top 100 wine estates in the world and is rated the #1 wine estate in Africa. In terms of just what they've done with the buildings, what they've done with the agriculture, the water conservation, and all the rest. And they've got some nice modern buildings there as well. Up on the hilltop, they've built a magnificent winery that actually goes inside the mountain. I can't wait to go and visit them. This is killing me, this lockdown. Honestly, with all the stuff I've learned about Culiacan in the last week or two preparing this, this is definitely first on my list when I get back to the Cape. And over the last few years, they've now brought out a full range of wines. And I'm going to be tasting and talking about their Chardonnay and their Reserve Chardonnay, and a wine they call GVB, which stands for Grown, Vinified and Bottled. GVB, Grown, Vinified and Bottled at Culiacan. And just talking briefly about these two wines, and then I'm going to hand back to Rob for the main event. So for those of you who just want an enthusiastic amateur's guide to wine drinking, let's start with the white wine. And there are different shape wine glasses, right? And actually the different shapes are important. Genuinely, seriously, the shape of the wine glass makes a magnificent difference to the shape to the taste of the wine. And this is not just something that wine gurus or those people who take their wine way too seriously talk about. This is genuinely serious. You don't even need to do blind testing on this. Literally just get different shaped wine glasses, put the same wine into it, and just taste them in a row. I promise you the wine will taste different. And there's scientific reasons for that. Different wine, every time you open a wine, the wine interacts with air and the oxygen, especially in the air, and the wine does two things. It evaporates, mainly the alcohol evaporates quickly, and it also oxidizes. There's probably better scientific words for that. But certain wines do better when they get more oxygen. And you've heard of them talking about breathing. That's what you do. You open the wine. I opened these wines 2 days ago, actually, because I like my Chardonnays and my Bordeaux blends to get a lot of air. And so this has been breathing in the bottle. And for me, a Chardonnay, this is the Chardonnay glass. It's a big round glass. And I also prefer my Chardonnay at room temperature, European room temperature. When you say room temperature for a wine, you're talking colonial room temperature. So room temperature with the aircon on, but about 17, 18 degrees. A lot of people actually hold Chardonnay in their hands to just warm it up a little bit as they drink it. Sauvignon Blancs, Viogniers, Rieslings are much better when they're crispy, crispy cold. But genuinely, if you've got a Chardonnay this evening and you are used to drinking Chardonnay very cold, just put a little bit in a separate glass, hold the glass like I'm holding it now, get a little bit of warmth into it, see if it's better for you. I think it is. So first thing you do with a wine is you hold it up to the light and you get a sense of the color. If you know what you're doing, you can probably already tell what kind of wine it is. Now, those of you who know Chardonnay, and I don't know how much value you're getting out of my computer's camera here, but the Culiacan Chardonnay is not your typical dark gold, heavy yellow color. In fact, if you look at it, you probably wouldn't guess it was a Chardonnay, which is interesting. Then you go in for the smell when you're going for your wine. And this is where you really want a big opening at the top for Chardonnay, because Chardonnay, one of the powerful parts of a Chardonnay is the big booming smell that you get, the nose as they call it. And in South Africa, our Chardonnays are famous for a very buttery type smell, which gets your mouth just salivating, ready to taste it. And then you go in for the taste. First of all, just line your mouth and feel what is happening on different parts of your mouth. And then you go in for one that you kind of swill around. Now, the Culiacan Chardonnay is exactly what I expected from the nose and from the color. It's not a big booming South African Chardonnay. If I'm a huge fan of Jordan wines, for example, and their Jordan 9 yards is like just putting raw butter in your mouth sometimes. If you like that kind of thing, well, then it's awesome. The Culiacan, I think, has got a much more European taste to it. It's got a bit of a tang to it, so you know it's not European, you know it's not a French wine, but it's got it's not that big booming buttery thing. So if you're not a Chardonnay fan, if you've put Chardonnay to the side and said it's not for me, but you like a big bold South African wine, I think the Culiacan Chardonnay is worth looking at, because it doesn't hit you in the face like a lot of big South African Chardonnays do, but it's not quite as mellow and as soft as the European. So they're somewhere in between those two things. If you know your Chardonnays, put Culiacan on your list. It's an interesting one. And I certainly enjoy it. So, are you enjoying your wine as much as I am? I hope you are. I'm enjoying mine fantastically. Please feel free to comment in the chats. I see a few people, Rudy, Peter, and a few others are chatting in. It's lovely to have you with us. And I'll try and keep up with the chats as Rob is talking. Second wine I just want to highlight this evening is one of my favorite types, which is a blend. When winemakers make wine, you start by taking specific grapes, and Culiacan has a lot of different types of grapes with a Cabernet Sauvignon grape available to them. And that's how you get the different types of wine. It's actually different types of grapes. But then obviously what you can do is you can start combining those together. And if you're very smart about it, you combine these in ways that bring out the best of each of the different types of wines. Back in 2013, which is the vintage here of this Culiacan GVB, let me get my notes here. This is not in my head. We have 4 wines here. So technically it's not a Bordeaux blend, because a Bordeaux blend would be 5 wines, but it's very much in that style. It's a 55% Cabernet Sauvignon. So those of you who know your wines, let's talk about what a blend does then, right? So a Cabernet Sauvignon, it has got it's a dark, fruity, heavy wine. And a lot of people who really like their red wines, that's their favorite, because it's that big booming red wine. Then they've added 35% Merlot. Now a Merlot gives you just a little bit of sort of more minerality to it, but comes in with a much kind of, it brings extra dark fruit to a blend. And so this, you can imagine, is a really, really fruity blend. Then they've added 5% Cabernet Franc. Now, I'm actually getting into Cabernet Franc to just drink straight on its own. It's got, it brings just an extra little sharpness, just a little, if even 5% of Cabernet Franc, you can taste it in a blend. You know that they've done it. It just adds a little edge to it, which in wine terms, they call tannins. Now, tannins, nobody has ever explained tannins properly to me. I've tried. Everybody just says, you know, when you taste a good red wine, right? And you go, it's like your mouth almost goes dry in your mouth. That's tannins. Yeah, there's a scientific, technical stuff in it, but it's that it gives you that feeling in your mouth, not just a taste, but also a feeling of the wine sort of taking over in your mouth. And the Cabernet Franc does that. And then just for fun, they threw in 5% of Petit Verdot. And I have no idea what that 5% does, but I'm telling you, I like this wine. So whatever it is, it does a good thing. So again, with wine, we have a look at the color. Now, because you've got Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, I mean, that's almost looking black on my camera, right? I mean, that's about as dark a wine as you'll ever see. I've got a spotlight aiming at me, and I'm looking literally through the spotlight, and I cannot see through that wine at all. That's exactly what you would expect. So this is going to be a heavy wine. Then you're going to go in for that smell, and wow, you're just getting plums and dark red fruits. And for those of you who have got, if you've got a Culiacan GVB in the house and you've opened it up with me now, wow, there's a lot more plum on there than I've smelt in a red wine in a while. Oh, and it's lovely. And then the taste, let's go for it. Now, here's the only problem with what we've done this evening, right? That's a 2013. I asked the guys at Culiacan to send me the oldest one they had in general release at the moment. And it's the 2013. They reckon that you should start drinking this thing when it's 15 years old. So, I mean, this is like just going into puberty at the moment. And I've had it open for 3 days already, and it is very nice and smooth, but I did ask them to send me 3 bottles. And I have organized my cellar based on years I want to drink it. And I've told my family that if I ever pass away unexpectedly, my ghost will haunt my family if they drink any of my wine earlier than what they are labeled to be drunk in the cellar. And this one, this 2013, I think I'm going to put in my 2030 cabinet. I think I'm going to leave it another 10 years at least to come back to this one. I use a wine app called Vivino, where I take a note of all the wines that I've drunk. And I've been doing it for 7 or 8 years now since Vivino came out. And I do, if I find a wine and I think, good grief, in 10 years' time, that wine's going to be amazing, I go and buy 2 or 3 more bottles. I put it away. And I've been doing this now for 15 years or so. So now I'm starting to come back to wines that I put away 12, 15 years ago. And then I'm tasting them and comparing my tasting notes. So I'm going to put a note in my diary for sometime in 2030 to remind myself to compare what this wine tastes like in the future. It's magnificent now. It really is. But that little Cabernet Franc tartness is going to slowly die away over the next few years. And this is going to be a remarkable wine, I can tell you, if we leave it for a while. Great to drink now, remarkable in a few years' time. Hey, I don't know if you enjoyed that or not. I have 2 glasses of wine to get through in the next 25 minutes while my friend Rob talks to you now about some other stuff that was going on in the Cape and in South African history. If that's been useful, interesting, helpful to you, I hope so. Enjoy whatever you're drinking this evening, and I'm going to hand over to Rob for the main event. Rob, the floor is yours.
Graeme, thank you sincerely. That was just wonderful and very, very interesting indeed. You know, Graeme, I'm a firm believer in coincidences in life and these little nuances that make our lives the interesting ones they are. I was lucky enough last year to do a talk in a very, very remote little place about 30 miles from Brecon in South Wales. And our host and his lovely wife had some framed pictures lying in the passageway of their home. And I recognized the Cape Dutch architecture and a very, very significant South African wine estate. And I immediately was able to put the notes together and learn that our hostess was indeed a Barlow who owned Culiacan and sold the farm to Anglo-American. They'd had the most wonderful time as a family on that farm. And one of the folks on our Zoom session tonight is my good friend Francois from Stellenbosch, who spent a great many very happy times as a teenager on that farm. Back to Vergelegen, a dear friend of mine who's here from the Natal Midlands. He was head boy of the local high school in his day. He's the new CEO down at Vergelegen. So these little coincidences that weave these stories together are the things that really give them the appeal for me. When considering what we were going to talk about tonight, I thought of a number of things. I thought about Vergelegen, the place is far away, getting there on an ox wagon and the difficulties. I thought of the significance and Vergelegen in terms of its significant history in South African winemaking and as a wine estate. And I thought, what am I going to speak about tonight? And I offered to talk about one decade in South African history that I think is particularly relevant, that being the 1830s. Right now, with issues regarding colonialism, statues and monuments being torn down, Black Lives Matter, there are so many things that we need to try and assess and look at objectively. So let's have a look at the 1830s down in the Cape. There were a large number of slaves involved in the development of the agriculture, the wine industry, and so forth in the Cape. The Dutch East India Company had a policy where when officials changed places, either from South Africa to Holland, Holland to South Africa to Batavia and back, they were allowed to take their slaves with them. And this is where a huge amount of the intermixing and the intermingling of the slaves took place. The slaves at that time came largely from places like Madagascar, Mozambique, Southern and Southeast Asia, and of course from Indonesia or Batavia. And of course there was addition to these slaves in terms of some of the ships that were captured or monitored by the Dutch East India Company. The slaves were appropriated. There's a famous story about 500 slaves off a ship, 250 being sent back to Angola, their homeland, 250 being incorporated into the culture of the Cape. Now, I find the slave industry absolutely abhorrent. It makes me nauseous in every way. I've visited the slave stations on the west coast of Africa. There's nothing more galling. I often speak about David Livingstone and the fact that his entire life was centered around attempting to curb and end the slave trade in Africa. So I want to concentrate rather on the more positive things that we can bring out of this tragic piece of our history. One is the religion that many slaves brought with them to the southwestern Cape and would eventually move with those slaves inland, as I'm going to try and explain. More importantly, perhaps, was the cuisine and the food and the music that these folks brought with them from various parts of the world that I think gives the Cape part of the miscellany and the plethora of cuisines and foods that are available. One of our staples in South Africa is good old bobotie, Cape Malay style, very, very prominently, largely came out of the Malay slaves that moved across here from Southeast Asia. And with the movement of people inland, the spices and any sort of addition that could improve or vary your diet a little became very important. And I want to mention here as a little aside that young Christian Smuts, who was born after the period I'm going to speak about, he was born in 1850 at Riebeek Wes. One day a Smos arrived with his wagon who was selling spices and so forth to these families that were established somewhere inland. And the Smos had a dog with him, and the dog attacked young Christian Smuts as a young boy. Well, Smuts, who I think was one of South Africa's very brave individuals and soldiers, had a great fear of dogs for the rest of his life. Now, in the early 1830s, there was legislation being promulgated for the ending of the slave trade, for the abolition of the slave trade, and it ended in South Africa officially by Benjamin de Urban in January of 1834. And slave owners in the Cape were told they had to release their slaves. They would be compensated for the slaves, but the compensation had to be collected in person in London. Now, can you imagine a farmer, Mr. Smith farming at De Aar, Mr. Kruger farming near Craddock, being told that he has to release his slaves and report in person in London for compensation? Now, we know that these Dutchmen largely, but there were many from other parts of Western Europe who had moved out of Europe largely after the Edict of Nantes and religious persecution and wanted to establish a better life here in South Africa. They were prone to movement. They had a great disdain for administration, for taxation, and for any sort of authority. And they were living in little isolated pockets in the inland of the Cape Colony, and they decided, no, we are going to pack up our livestock, our families, and our slaves, and we're going to set off inland into the hinterland of South Africa. And it was this movement of people that began largely on account of the abolition of slavery and the resultant compensation method that became known as the Great Trek or the Great Movement. And it is a chapter in South Africa's history that I fear has been very poorly taught and told. It is an epic of human struggle and endeavor. Those wagons, many of them the same sort of wagons that Van der Stel would have used to get inland past Somerset West and into that valley at Vergelegen, they used. They had larger rear wheels than front wheels, and they were pulled by a team of oxen. The oxen were the prized possession of these folks. You had to have very good leading oxen that could keep up a sustainable pace, leading the team at the front. The rear 4 oxen in front of the wagon were your big, strong, plodding beasts, and they were the ones that were never known to take a shortcut because you couldn't have them going too close to a corner or too close to the edge of the cliff. So those 2 pairs, those 4 oxen directly in front of the wagon were as important as the ones right in the front of a 12 or 16 ox team, 6 or 8 pairs of oxen. And the stories that abound regarding the difficulties of these folks moving inland are simply astounding and fall outside the ambit of our little talk here tonight. And obviously, these trekkers, these folks moving inland, came into contact with local black people as they went. And I want to concentrate for a moment here on a large group who moved around the top end, the northern side of Lesotho, land of the Drakensberg, near the present Sterkfontein Dam, not very far from Harrismith. And they looked down into Natal. And Natal looked to them like the land of milk and honey. High, well-watered, disease-free, very good for the production of livestock and indeed human beings. And for these folks who trekked all the way from the Cape, thousands of kilometers to get to that position, I bet they felt that they've arrived at the Garden of Eden. But the Garden of Eden was already occupied by a magnificent group of Bantu people called the Zulus, who had moved down from East Africa 12 or 1500 years previously. They had a new king, Dingaan, who'd murdered his half-brother, Shaka. And if you wanted to live and indeed occupy land within this Garden of Eden, you better make a deal with the bees who were already resident in that land of milk and honey, the Zulus. And this is where the duplicity that I mentioned in the little teaser to our event here tonight comes in. Because Piet Retief tried to negotiate for land, leader of the trekkers, with King Dingaan, king of the Zulus. And Dingaan said that a large number of cattle had been stolen by men riding horses wearing European clothes, indicating that they had been stolen by trekkers. Piet Retief parried and said no, that they'd been stolen by a recalcitrant Hlubi chieftain called Sikonyela, who was a Basotho living in the foothills of the Drakensberg. And Dingaan said, well, if you come in a spirit of peace and goodwill, recover the cattle and return them to us, their rightful owners. Now, Piet Retief had had some earlier dealings with Sikonyela and captured him in the most novel and legendary way. He said, Sikonyela, I've got some new bracelets for you. Please extend your forearms to receive them. Out went the forearms and snap on went the handcuffs, and Sikonyela was captured without a shot being fired. The cattle were easily recaptured and driven all the way back across Natal, back to Umgungundlovu, the seat of King Dingaan. Now, I want you to bear in mind here and to consider just for a moment the psychology within the minds of the Zulus. These trekkers had with them bang sticks, guns, firearms. They had with them mirrors. These Zulu people had hitherto seen their countenance reflected in a pool of water, and the bang sticks and these mirrors gave them the immediate impression that these trekkers were wizards. They were witches. They were capable of witchcraft and wizardry and magic. And now Piet Retief returns with the 600 cattle. Scouts had preceded him and said that he'd captured Sikonyela without a shot being fired, snapped on the handcuffs, recovered the cattle, and this impression of wizardry, this potent impression of what these white men were perhaps capable of, took on a whole new meaning in the mind and the psychology of the Zulus. Well, apparently a treaty was signed between Dingaan and Piet Retief. I say apparently because Dingaan was illiterate and would not have known any of the contents of any such treaty. And then he said, to celebrate the reaching of this agreement and a treaty that ceded some land south of the Buffalo and the Tugela rivers in the colony of Natal to the trekkers, we're going to have a celebration of dancing and singing. And it's not our custom to dance and sing with the horses and the guns around us. So the horses and the guns were left outside of that huge cattle enclosure, that cattle kraal at Mkungungrov. And you need to imagine the scene. Hundreds of beehive straw huts, that big hut of the king surrounded by izikahlo of wives. Thousands of Zulus are gyrating and dancing and singing and perspiring. And in the middle sit this little knot of 70 trekkers under Piet Retief becoming more and more uneasy. Bear in mind, please, for the purposes of balance in this little talk, that Boers, trekkers, had already descended off the escarpment at Sterkfontein Dam down into Natal and had spread out along the Blauwkrans and the Bushman's River and the Mooi River and were already farming, which I think is premature and quite inflammatory sometime before a treaty had been established between Dingaan and Retief. And suddenly in the middle of this great occasion, Dingaan, who was a big man, leapt to his feet and shouted, "Bulala da baba tagati," kill the wizards. Zulu warriors leapt up and bound up Piet Retief and his followers with leather thongs. They were dragged out of that great cattle enclosure over the little Mkumbani stream and up onto a nearby hill. And Piet Retief was forced to watch whilst his followers, including two of his sons, were killed. And because they were considered to be wizards, many were destined to go the wizard's way. That is, to be impaled rectum first onto a sharpened stake in the ground and left to die. Piet Retief was amongst the last to be killed that fateful day, the 6th of February, 1838. And with that, large impies, large armies of Zulu warriors took off into Natal and fell upon those Boer lagers and farms that had been established prematurely in the Midlands of Natal, not far from this beautiful part of the world I call home. It was an orgy of slaughter. It lasted for about 48 hours. 537 aged women and children were killed. Now, legend has it amongst the Boers that a 12-year-old girl survived those massacres, and she was found some days later, multiple stab wounds, almost dead from loss of blood, emaciated, and she was raised by the Anglican minister in the little town of Colenso, and her name was Sari Marais. And Sari Marais, as a result, became a great folk hero for the Afrikaner people, and they took the words from an American folk song called My Ellie Ree and put to that music the words of that famous song, May Sari Marais. And I share this because David Rattray often used to stalk and hunt with Prince Charles at Balmoral, and he used to stay at Burke Hall, hosted by the Queen Mother. And the Queen Mother told David once that outside of her native Scotland, she loved our land, South Africa, more than anywhere else on earth. And she said, you know, David, when I visited your country, your people used to sing a song that was very important to them. And David said, Your Majesty, what would that song be? And that little white-haired woman began to hum the tune of My Ellie Ree, associated with May Sari Marais. So I have a lovely picture of David Rattray looking like a penguin in his dinner jacket and suit, sitting with the Queen Mother on a little couch at Burke Hall, trying to sing together that famous song, May Sari Marais. Well, legend or not, it's a wonderful, wonderful tale. And the Boers immediately retaliated and sent a patrol off into Zululand to try and retaliate for the slaughter of Piet Retief and his followers. That patrol was ambushed at Italeni near Shawi. And a man called Dirkie Uys, who became another great folk hero of the Afrikaner people, rode back into the Zulus, who had surrounded his father, who'd become unseated. He'd fallen off his horse. And father and son died together, Dirkie Uys too, becoming a great folk hero of the Afrikaner people. Well, they then enlisted the help of a military genius called Andries Pretorius to come up from the Eastern Cape. The Eastern Cape and Grahamstown at that time was a seat of wagon making in South Africa. Very important in all of these stories were the wagons, which were crucial to Boer life, to the trekkers, and one of their most prized possessions, along with their team of oxen. And Andries Pretorius came up to Natal and assembled about himself 464 able-bodied fighting men, 350 retainers, 64 fighting wagons. They called them vrachtwagens. These were small, maneuverable wagons, could be quickly moved in and out of position. And they began to advance up into Zululand to try and retaliate against the killing of Piet Retief and his followers. Within his group, he had a priest called Cyril Cillier. And isn't it interesting to consider that in this country, for 1 week leading up to the Battle of Blood River, which I'm going to relate shortly, from the 9th to the 16th of December of 1838, Cyril Cillier led the men in prayer, saying, God, if you give us victory over these people, the Zulus, we will keep the day holy for the rest of time and build a church in your honor in our capital, Pietermaritzburg. Well, I want you to imagine them eventually setting up a laager. This was a defensive arrangement of wagons in a D shape of those 64 fighting wagons between a deep hippopotamus pool on the Ngome River, a great big ravine caused by erosion, what we South Africans call a donga, a washed out, eroded gully and a marsh. And this laager was set up deep in a valley, surrounded on all sides by high ground. That's how confident Andries Pretorius was. Now, if the Zulus had known that Boer gunpowder was highly responsive to moisture and drizzle and mist, they would have attacked before the dawn. Because during that unearthly night, the Boers could hear noises coming from the darkness. It was pitch black, but were unaware of what those noises were. They'd suspended lamps on whipsticks outside of the laager to illuminate the entire place. They'd put little fighting gates, veghekke, built of hard acacia wood, between the wheels of the wagons and between each wagon, that no attacker could crawl under the wagons or between them and get into the laager. The horses and the cattle in large numbers were contained within the laager. Well, the Zulus allowed the mist and the drizzle of that night to burn off. And then with characteristic vigor, aggression, and bravery, would attack that laager the following morning. Well, they were impeded by the marsh, the hippopotamus pool, and that huge eroded gully. They were unable to get close enough really to wreak havoc against those wagons. And when their attacks began to fail, Andries Pretorius released the Boer horsemen to ride out against the Zulus. And these Boer horsemen pursued the Zulus into the Ngome River, that deep hippopotamus pool, and got onto the reed beds and banks above the river and began to fire down into the Zulus trying to cross the river. And the legend has it that eventually the water of the river began to run red with blood. Hence the name of that battle, probably one of the most pivotal battles in our country's history, the Battle of Blood River, the 16th of December of 1838. And I always say that folks who are interested in the history of South Africa, particularly in the separatist history that needs to be carefully considered today, those who feel it began earnestly in 1948 or perhaps 110 years late, they need to look at this battle 110 years earlier, where the Boers were given the unequivocal understanding and belief in their minds that they were the chosen people in the promised land. They never lost a man at Blood River. The only injury of any significance was an assegai thrust into the right hand of Andries Pretorius that affected his ability to write thereafter. The Zulus lost, we believe, around 3,000 men that fateful morning. The water of the river ran red with blood. And Andries Pretorius and his men would proceed to Umgungundlovu, the seat of King Dingaan. King Dingaan in panic with his people, had torched their own capital and fled off into the hills close to the Swaziland border. Now, Mgungundlovu, as a result, is an incredible place to visit today, because with the torching of the capital on Christmas Day of 1838, the heat created by the burning of those beautiful dome-shaped thatch huts baked the clay and cow dung bases of the huts. And today, 182 years on, you can still visit Mgungundlovu and see very clearly the size of that impressive Zulu royal city, the cattle kraal contained within. And imagine the little Mkombani stream often running dry today, and the little hill on the other side where Piet Retief and his men were taken and killed. There is a monument in their memory, and they lie buried there in a mass grave. Now, these matters, the abolition of slavery, the great trek, an incredible chapter in South African history, leading up eventually to the Battle of Blood River, this pivotal battle in December of 1838, saw the Zulus lose all faith in their King Dingaan. He would be poisoned shortly thereafter in 1840 near Ingwavuma on the Swaziland, South African, Mozambique border. And I just thought it would be important tonight, and I hope perhaps reflective, for us to consider the significant decade in South African history, the 1830s, to link this decade with this wonderful and famous South African wine estate, and enjoy some infotainment hosted by Graeme and myself. I really hope you've enjoyed that. Back to Graeme.
Oh, Rob, thank you very much. I'm seeing a lot of people giving you the virtual hand clap this evening. As always, Rob, you've done magnificently. You know what, there's that old saying that they say that history is written by the winners, right? The history books are written by the winners. What I always appreciate about you, Rob, is that you move beyond that. You look at the history from all the different angles, trying to bring each of the different elements, especially in this country that has so many different stories that need to be told. Somehow you just managed to pull all the stories together. There were great stories of endeavor. There were great stories of villainy on all sides of each of these stories, isn't there? Nobody's a saint and nobody's a complete demon in history. And your stories always bring that out. So thanks again, Rob. It's been wonderful to hear another great South African story this evening.
Graeme, thank you very much. You know, David Rattray always said that history is the propaganda of the victor. But more importantly than all that, it was Napoleon who famously said that history is simply a pack of lies agreed upon. And those words always affected me profoundly, and trying to tell stories the way that I am and negotiate the minefield that South Africa really is today in terms of a commentary. I find it very important in terms of trying to draw the different threads and the different protagonists together and offer, I hope, a reasonably objective story. And I hope folks will have the interest piqued and want to go out and read more and research more, because I want to tell you, in present times, Graeme, the 1830s in South Africa is a very interesting decade to look at.
It absolutely is, and we absolutely need to be telling our history. All over the world, we have to tell our history, but maybe more than ever in South Africa itself. Our history is what formed all of us. Not any of us have escaped that history. And as we make history again these days, it's a great reminder for us to bring our past to life. And Rob, nobody does it better than you. Thank you, everybody. That's all we wanted to do this evening, just a little bit of a diversion from the 100 days of lockdown. Congratulations, South Africans. This is your 100th day. You can raise your bat. You've reached the century. Unfortunately, it's not out yet. But 100 days. Rob, you've helped us wonderfully this evening. Culiacan, thank you so much to you guys, to Wayne and the team there, for giving, well, at least I don't know what everybody else was drinking, but it worked for me. Whatever you were drinking this evening, I hope it worked for you. Rob, I'll leave the final word with you, and then we'll say goodbye to everybody.
Well, Graeme, I think that the group we've had tonight in this live chat has been fantastic. I see almost 100 folks involved. I hope more than anything that they have enjoyed the Saturday evening. I, for one, have so appreciated the fact that they've joined us and given us an hour of their time. I hope it's been worthwhile. I would be delighted to have some folks decide to join me on Patreon. And more importantly than that, Graeme, I hope very much that you and I can do something similar at some point in the future. It's been great fun. To one and all, thank you sincerely.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Graeme.